One. Hey everybody, this is Saad for the Saad Truth. I've got a big evolutionary fish for you. The net has caught a big one today. I've got with me Professor Pascal. Let me tell you a bit about him before I allow him to say hello. He is the Henry Luce Professor of Individual and Collective Memory. I love that title. From Washington University in St. Louis. Unbelievable Google Scholar citations. Over 11,000. His books include Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought, which was the book that I first familiarized me with his work. The Naturalness of Religious Ideas, A Cognitive Theory of Religion. Tradition as Truth and Communication. And then several edited works, including Memory in Mind and Culture and Cognitive Aspects of Religious Symbolism. You've been busy. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very good, Gad, and it's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Likewise. As I said, I first... quote, discovered your work way back in the early 2000s. And then, I've always, followed some of your work. And then recently I was at UNLV, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I had been invited by the School of Life Sciences to speak there on one of my recent papers. And during the visit, I hung out with Pierre Liénard, who is an anthropologist with whom you've worked closely, and his lab. And at one point he was talking about his famous BBS target article. BBS stands for Behavioral and Brain Sciences. But I hadn't made the connection then that is the paper that I had published a commentary on, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'd like you to talk about it because that paper was absolutely fantastic. It's a 2006 paper on precautionary systems and ritualized behaviors. Could you tell us a bit about that? And then I'll talk about my commentary to that paper.
Okay, well, the goal of the paper was to look at a question that lots of people have talked about for a long time, including Sigmund Freud, sort of saying that there were parallels between, what you find in lots of religious rituals, that is, order, symmetry, repetition, and what you find in some pathologies, what we now call obsessive compulsive disorder, that Freud called Zwangsneurose. The interesting thing is, I remember reading this little article of Freud where he described that, and being so extraordinarily disappointed because he said that you find these parallels. And at the end of the article, he says, well, that means that in a way, maybe obsessive compulsive disorder is a form of private religion and religion is a form of collective obsession. And that's the end. And you think, but why on earth are these things the same? Why should they be similar? So what Pierre and I did was look at the literature on OCD, but also take a good look at the literature on ritualized behavior. And what we thought was that there is a way of organizing behavior that you find in these two contexts, but you also find in other things, like, little children like to engage in rituals. People who are anxious tend to ritualize their behavior. A colleague of mine, David Elam, in Israel, published lots of things on sportsmen and the way they ritualize some of their behaviors. For example, basketball players, where before they take, one of those hoops that are extremely difficult, they perform all sorts of rituals. Basically, our idea was that when you engage in ritualized behavior, what you do is that you perform actions in a way where the goals of each actions is sort of put between brackets, and you perform a series of actions that are likely to evoke some ancestral dangers and also some ancestral precautions. So we said that, it's no surprise perhaps for us that lots and lots of ritual behavior is about purification, about getting rid of stuff that is described in terms of contamination. And that lots of the precautions, for example, are to do with washing, cleansing, purifying by fire, and all sorts of things like that. So there's much more in the detailed model, but the basic idea was that for the minds we have, the minds that evolved in contexts where we had lots of danger and lots of precautions to take, rituals are a kind of gadget that hijacks our threat detection mechanisms. And because of that, there are fascinating. It doesn't mean that they do anything really beyond that. This is part of a way of looking at culture where we say, well, many cultural phenomena do not exist because they do something terribly interesting. They only exist because they're attention grabbing enough for human minds to engage in them, to find them more interesting than not doing these things. That's all.
Got it. I want to get back to the hijacking byproduct element, which was covered in your 2001 book. But I want to talk about how I came to comment on that paper, which will demonstrate something that I'm very fond of, which I think every scientist should be very fond of, and that's the idea of consilience, the idea of unity of knowledge. So I was working on my first book then. In 2007 book came out, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, and one of the chapters in that book, I talk about the evolutionary roots of dark side consumption, things like pathological gambling, compulsive buying, eating disorders, pornographic addictions. And when I was doing my research for each of these different dark side consumatory acts, when I came to compulsive buying, well, as you know, that could easily be linked to an instantiation of OCD, hoarding, right? And so in thinking about how I would Darwinize the area of compulsive buying. So for example, even without looking into the literature, I had predicted that to the extent that women are the ones who are almost overwhelmingly the sufferers of compulsive buying, they wouldn't be hoarding domain general items. They wouldn't be hoarding lawnmowers and widgets, but they would be hoarding things that are related to a very specific domain-specific module. In this case, beautification. So it's an adaptive process that becomes maladaptive by misfiring, by becoming hyper-vigilant, if you like. Mm-hmm. And so starting with that idea, I then had the idea, and then I ended up writing a paper in a medical journal on it, and then commented on your target paper. I thought, well, since now I'm becoming more familiar with OCD, I bet you that there are universal sex-specific instantiations of OCD that happen in exactly the same way around culture. So for example, the O stands for obsession, the C stands for compulsion. I'm saying this not for you, but for our viewers. You obviously know it. Some OCD manifestations are much more likely to afflict women. Some OCD manifestations are much more likely to afflict men. Some are equally likely across the two sexes. Well, I could predict, and it turns out to be true, even though I wasn't an OCD researcher, but because I came armed with the evolutionary lens, that's which ones would fall into which category. So for example, OCD rumination, so intrusive thoughts about, did I say something stupid at yesterday's party that made me lose social status? Well, I could predict that men are going to be the overwhelm. Other types of OCDs would be women. And so with that background, that's how I came to comment on your paper. So now you know the background to how you and I intersected.
Well, there's a huge, that's great to hear, because obviously this is one of the things that happens a lot when you do, and that's one of the great benefits of doing research in an evolutionary framework, is that, it's one of the pitfalls sometimes that you have to make claims that belong to different disciplines or traditions, and you may not be as competent as you wish. But then what happens is the converse, that people become interested in what these hypotheses could bring. So that's really great. There's a lot of I must say about OCD and about psychopathology in general that I am very disappointed in the science of psychopathology and psychiatry in general, and for lots of reasons. But one of them is that because of the medicalization of these conditions, and also because of the fact that we have pretty effective medicines, research into the basic science is not quite as prominent as it used to be. So, for example, for OCD, people like the people who propose these sort of safety model, like Henry Sechman and Eric Woody, or people who do other kinds of models of OCD, this is kind of marginal in clinical psychology and psychiatry, because most of it is about what pills to give people and which ones work better. But this is without a great understanding of why is there such a condition and why does it manifest itself? I had the same sort of disappointment when I was working on religion, and lots of people told me, oh, lots of the supernatural beliefs you're talking about, lots of psychotic people have their own private sort of generation of beliefs of that kind. And then I would say, and this was from psychiatrists or clinical psychologists, and I would tell them, well, that's fantastic. Where is the database where you guys put all these things together? And they told me there is no such database. We don't do that. So when someone reports that they have, for example, an obsession that they must do something in a particular order, etc., basically the clinical psychologist or psychiatrist does not take down the details of all that stuff. What they take down is she spends 2 hours doing nonsense rituals. And of course, that's true. And of course, that's what the problem is and what they're trying to, palliate. However, for us, it would be very interesting to see what do they actually do, in what way do they do it. I mentioned David Elam, who's one of the few people who do that kind of work, and he came from animal behavior. And he tried to apply that to OCD people, filming them and producing very detailed description of how they do their rituals. And that, to a certain extent, supports the idea that this is about threat detection and overactive threat detection. But the thing is that this had to come from animal behavior.
Right.
You see what I mean? No psychiatrist would think that it's interesting to film an obsessive patient doing obsessive things for 3 hours and then list all the actions they do and in what order they do them.
So do you think that your concern could be mapped onto the idea that certainly you and I are familiar with, and maybe some of our viewers, the difference between proximate level explanations and ultimate levels, right? So to the extent that, medicine has made great progress while still only operating at the proximate level, then of course many practitioners of medicine, or in this case clinical psychology or psychiatry, don't feel the need to ever escape to the ultimate world because they don't think that they really need it. And of course, someone like Randy Nesse, whom you know and who was on the show, says, well, no, there are really very important insights that are reaped if you incorporate ultimate level thinking into medical practice. So do you think that ultimately your concern could be mapped onto this dichotomy between ultimate and proximate?
Well, there is that, but there's also the fact that in some cases, especially in psychiatry, the situation is a bit worse than that in the sense that if you look at physiology, people have a good description of the proximate mechanisms. For example, we know mechanisms of infection and stuff like that, and mechanisms of immune response. Excuse me. And then we can have explanations of why it is the way it is. Now, in the case of psychiatry, I think the problem is that the proximate description is really not there. In the sense that, what happens in the mind of someone who spends 2 hours a day, for example, preparing a cup of tea that they don't drink in the end, but it takes 2 hours because every little detail is scripted and has to be repeated a certain number of times. Now, what happens in that mind is something that I think is not really researched. And as I said, it's mostly because if you can, after all, the point of most clinical psychology is to do clinical work and to sort of help patients. So if you can do that through medication, then the motivation for basic research is kind of lost or demoted at some point.
This issue actually arose in my recent chat with, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, Jordan Peterson, who recently rose to fame because of all his public engagements. He's also a clinical psychologist. And in our most recent chat, I asked him, his thoughts about this idea that, to borrow the term from Robin Dawes's book, House of Cards, the idea that much of clinical work is built on a theoretical foundation that is akin to a house of cards. And then I was explaining to him that one of the reasons why I decided to not pursue, I was very interested in clinical work, and I thought that maybe I would do that. Both be a professor and a clinician. But then the more I read in these areas prior to deciding what my eventual PhD work would be on, this is prior to entering the PhD, I thought that there was so much sort of guru stuff, right? There'd be the Lacanian approach and the Freudian approach and all these other bullshit approaches. And it just didn't seem scientific enough for me. And so I thought that, okay, well, I'm interested in consumer behavior, consumer psychology. I will go down this road. And then, of course, I married evolutionary psychology. So in a sense, you're confirming one of my concerns, which is that much of clinical work, notwithstanding, Darwin blessed them for all the work that they do, it's often really rooted in quackery.
Well, even if you don't go that far, but there's lots of it. Even if you look at serious work, I think there is a problem there in the sense that it's a very general problem of psychology, that the distance, the causal distance between the low levels of pharmacology, for example, at which we know that giving a patient something that inhibits reuptake of serotonin in neurons has an effect 2 weeks or 3 weeks later on their mood and the way they see stuff. We have absolutely no model of how one could possibly cause the other. It's sort of, in cognitive terms, it's a complete mystery. Because it's a complete mystery, of course, it's discouraging and disheartening, and people would rather do something that gets results. In the end, lots of science is guided by the old, totally feeble joke that the guy who's looking for his keys on the lamppost, and people said, but that's not where you lost them, and he said, well, but that's where the light is good. Okay, so and that's very often the case that it's very difficult to approach domains like that where it's not conceivable that we'll really understand connections between neural level activity and cognitive things in the last 50 years. It's really not going to happen very soon. So it's better to try and at least get results in the meantime. So I think that's understandable. And the quackery is there too. When I grew up, spent part of my youth in Paris, and the quackery could be breathed in the air. It was.
You're referring to the French postmodernists, no?
Well, they were not postmodernists at the time. There were psychoanalysts. Right. There were, sort of weird mixtures of
just a different strain of bullshit. Just a different strain.
There are lots of strains, and to people who are interested in them, those are a subtle palette of different kinds of bullshit.
I was going to say that what you were referring to earlier reminds me also of the tension between economists. So I was trained within the psychology of decision-making, paradigm, and as a doctoral student, and there was constantly this discussion of normative decision-making versus prescriptive decision-making versus descriptive decision-making. So the classical economists didn't care what was in the black box. All they cared about is that if they had a model that was very predictive, then who cares? Whereas the psychologists and the behavioral scientists are saying, no, but I actually care about the veracity of the description of what's in the model. So in a sense, that speaks to the tension that you're speaking of. The clinical psychologist may not care about all of the actual mechanisms as long as the intervention proves to be useful and valuable.
Yeah, and in a way you could defend that. It's perfectly, perfectly honest and a good position to have. In the case of economists, it's a bit different in the sense that it's not that difficult to study people making decisions, if you see what I mean. And indeed, in the last 50 years, people have been doing that. So when you're, as an economist, you say, well, I don't even want to go there because my formal models, satisfy some equilibrium constraints, so I'm good. It's a bit of a different decision. It's more sort of a radical sort of shift away from empirical research.
Got it. I guess we'll come back later, maybe if we have time, to discuss some of your recent interests at the intersection of evolution and economics. But for now, and I also want to, of course, cover your religion stuff. But I wanted to talk about something that you had sent me in an email as a possible topic, and that is, the reticence that many people have in accepting evolutionary psychology and evolutionary principles in explaining human behavior. And these could be either people at large, just lay people, or it could be some of our fellow academics who are otherwise sophisticated, intelligent, educated people, but have this visceral animus towards EP. Maybe you could comment, if you want, on both groups.
Well, I must tell you about a very funny paper that I saw in thanks to that wonderful Twitter feed that's called Real Peer Review.
Love it. I'm addicted to it.
That makes fun of lots of nonsense science by just citing it and quoting it extensively. And there was that the study of people's reactions to people's descriptions of various behaviors and their idea of whether those behaviors could be described in terms of inherent natural qualities or accidents and nurture and things like that, including behaviors like, roosters trying to protect hens and attack intruders and stuff like that. And the funny thing was that, if anything, the people who had more education, and that meant at a university level, were far more likely to say that a rooster protects their hens or wants to mate with them because it's been sort of a learned behavior that he's acquired from the local culture of roosterdom, so to speak, the sort of chicken patriarchy. So it's quite interesting that actually most of the population is not that resistant to these ideas. It's more that people are educated in that. And I'll tell you another thing about that, which is that I teach evolutionary psychology. And what I see very often is that students who are just sort of open-minded and want to understand things will say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe it's not entirely true. Maybe it's true. What do you think about this? And they will discuss these ideas in terms of what they say about a certain behavior. Like, do we actually explain nationalism in terms of group dynamics and coalitional psychology? And the students will say, well, yes, but I mean, what if it extends to millions of people? Does it really work the same way? So they're really having a critical and interesting debate. But other students have been, I think, infected with bad social science, and they say, oh, but it's the social, it's not the natural. The social and the natural are different realms of reality. And I said, no, this is just funny metaphysics, but it's not, we're trying to explain something here. So it seems to me that in general, if you tell people that in most societies where you go, women tend to have a preference for men who show authority, competence, humor, intelligence, and men tend to show a preference for women who show signs of youth and fertility and health. Most people in most places in the world will say, duh. Do you need scientists to say that and to establish that? And unfortunately, we do. I mean, we do for two reasons. One is that there is a sort of culture of academia that says, no, these things cannot possibly be true. But also, we do need to explain it because all these things, that's for me the great merit of evolutionary approaches to anything, is that they make things strange. The comments seem strange. So, of course, men tend to like women who show signs of health and fertility in youth. Why? Of course, for example, fathers in all human societies are interested in their offspring. Now, if you told that to a chimpanzee anthropologist, they would say, why? What the hell is that about? You sire, offspring, and then you move on. Why should you pay any attention? So we have all these behaviors that are pretty self-evident to us. And the great merit of an evolutionary approach is to say, well, there's nothing self-evident about that. It could have been completely different. So there has to be some explanation for this. And I think that to go back to your point about academia and lots of people resisting these ideas, I think there's another question here, which is that most people who go into academia went into academia to be smarter than common folk. And, it's part of the perks, that you know things that lots of people don't know, or that you know that lots of ideas are, not quite right. And that's okay when the ideas you acquire are better than those of common folk, but it's not when they're just as nonsensical as those of common folk. And I see this tendency, for example, in the field of social psychology, where, for example, all our research into stereotypes about people has been guided by the idea that stereotypes are wrong, and that when they're wrong, and they're of course very detrimental to social interactions. And then comes a psychologist like Lee Josim, who systematically reviews all those results and says, well, on the whole, people get it right. And not just that, but when they get a group right, but an individual stands out as being different, they do not misperceive that individual. They actually correct their stereotype to understand that individual. Now, I think for lots of academic psychologists, this is really annoying, because a lot of psychology is based on the idea that the mind doesn't work very well, that it doesn't do what it should be doing, and that we psychologists are clever because we can show you that how wrong we are about everything. And then it turns out, and that's also a consequence of some evolutionary psychology models, that people have, for example, intuitions about how to build groups that are fairly efficient if you want to build groups. That coalitional ideas are pretty efficient if you want to maintain solidarity within a group. And of course, that goes against this general grain of psychology of trying to say, well, the mind is badly designed, it doesn't do what it should be doing, it's full of illusions, stereotypes, fallacies, and so on. An example of that was, for example, there was a very long, in the literature on decision making, and the tradition has been overwhelmingly about what are called biases and heuristics. The idea being that people are often wrong because they ignore base rates, they make decisions on the basis of salient examples, and so on and so forth. And then come other psychologists who say, well, first of all, they don't really ignore base rates. It's only if you present them in a funny, abstract way. But also, salient examples are salient for a reason. The way people reason is ecologically more valid than it seems. So I think, very often evolutionary psychology ends up saying, well, the mind is well designed with something that is not exactly, what we thought, but it's pretty efficient at doing what it does. That often is sort of off-putting. But the main reason, of course, is that there is a very strong idea that there is nature, there is nurture, there is nature and culture, that nature is for the right-wing people who want to say that biology is everything, and culture is for the cool people who want to say that things could be very different, and so on and so forth. And this sort of extremely simplistic ontology is what guides lots of these reactions. I remember one time, just to give you a final anecdote, that I was in London. That's a very, very long time ago, like 15 years ago, and I was giving my usual spiel that religions are the way they are; they're different, but the mind is the same. And religions can be explained by the way our minds work. And someone at the end stood up and was really, really outraged and said that it was outrageous in this day and age that someone would defend scientific racism. And what he mentioned was that I had said that all human beings have the same brain.
And that statement was
evidence for racism.
Right.
And of course, lots of people were a bit baffled. But then it turned out that it turns out that it's kind of makes some perverse sense, in the sense that if you talk about the brain, you're talking about biology. Biology is race is Nazis,
right,
and so on and so forth. And you get all this sort of concatenation of weirdly vague ideas that go together to converge on the idea that this is evil.
So I'm going to break up my sort of response to what you're saying into different categories of detractors. So I think some people detest evolutionary psychology for emotional reasons, right? And typically, the emotional reason will be because evolutionary psychology is perceived as an attack on their pet ideology. Okay, so for example, if I am a radical feminist who believes that all sex differences are socially constructed short of our genitalia, then I'm obviously not going to like any evolutionary principle that argues for innate sex differences. If I'm a postmodernist who believes that there are no universal truths, then I'm certainly not going to like the words human universals as used by evolutionary psychologists. If I am a social constructivist who believes that humans are born tabula rasa, and then it's only we are receptacles of socialization, but there are no biological blueprints in our brains, then I'm not going to, if I'm a religious person, I'm not going to like evolutionary psychology for the obvious reasons. And so I would put one set of detractors as they are ideologues who despise EP simply because their foundational belief systems would crumble if EP is, quote, correct. Then there are sort of the cognitive obstacles. And actually, I'm thinking now of formalizing all this into a paper. So anybody who's watching who's an academic, if you steal this, I'm coming after you. Then there's the cognitive obstacles, cognitive/epistemological. And this is where people don't understand the epistemology of EP. So, for example, the one that angers me the most of all of the attacks is the just so storytelling, right? Because that's the one that is typically levied by otherwise sophisticated colleagues of ours, right? And so my recent paper, which I published in Journal of Marketing Research, where I was explaining the method of EP, the method meaning the epistemological method, I was arguing that if a real serious evolutionary scientist actually does the exact opposite of just so storytelling, in other words, their evidentiary threshold for accepting a hypothesis is profoundly higher than the bullshit research that you do in your lab with 30 undergraduates, right? It's because you're building nomological networks of cumulative evidence, starting with Charles Darwin when he collected 1 million different observations stemming from every possible field before it becomes unassailable that his theory is correct. So the exact thing that you keep attacking evolutionary psychology on is exactly the opposite of what we do. So I think, and here, let me just give you one other one that falls within the cognitive/epistemological. Yeah. Richard Dawkins talks about middle world, right? Our brains didn't evolve to understand things at the nano level. Our brains don't find it very weird to think at the cosmological level. And so really we operate at middle world, right? Well, similarly, when it comes to the distal explanations that are typically evoked in evolutionary psychology, most people can't understand this stuff. And so you go, stop with this bullshit post hoc theorizing. So does that seem like a useful sort of dichotomy or taxonomy, emotional versus cognitive?
Sure. And I think the cognitive the problems may be very profound in lots of ways, in the sense that, first of all, I must tell you that I used to have a webpage that I don't have anymore because I couldn't be bothered to maintain it, which was a sort of set of quotations of people saying that F-Psych was just so stories, and then having zero reference.
Can you send me those quotes?
I will try to find that, because that was really interesting. People saying, well, of course, evolutionary psychologists will say that it's because of our genes and that we have this and this and that. And then there was zero quotation. So the just so story was a just so story. That was the only.
It's a meta just so story.
It was a meta one, but the cognitive difficulties may be great in the sense that evolution is intrinsically a population phenomenon, and it's very difficult for us to think in population terms. So I see that these days I'm interested in how our minds work when we turn to very modern things like modern economies. And this is one of those problems that we have. For example, when we think about, is that we think in terms not of populations, but of types and general categories. So, for example, we think that the giraffe, so to speak, grew a longer neck to reach, for leaves, and to use, and assuming that this is the right explanation, that for long necks in giraffes, when I have to tell my students, no, it's not short, that is that lots of giraffes have long necks, short necks, and middle necks, and some of them survive better or reproduce more than others. And even deeper is that the genome that creates those long necks has more likelihood to be represented. Now, this is a population phenomenon. It's very difficult to think of it in population terms. We're not equipped for that. So apply that, for example, to modern economic phenomena. Should we have so take a simple example, like should we have minimum wages? So lots of people say yes, because it's really bad to work for $8 an hour. It would be much better to work for $15 an hour. And if all the people who worked for $8 got 15, they would be much better off. And of course, that's perfectly true, and that's a very good motivation for something like that. However, economists then say, well, the problem then is that labor being more expensive, there will be less demand for it, so there will be fewer jobs. So maybe the ones who were at $14.50 will get bumped up to 15, and they'll be very happy. The ones who were at $8, they will not be employed anymore because employers will find other solutions. Now, the thing about that is that this kind of argument is very difficult for people to approach because it's a population argument. The idea is that out of all the employers, there are employers who are prepared to pay people $15 no matter what they do. There are people who are prepared to pay people not a cent more than $8. And you have all sorts of things in the middle. Now, the effect of changing the price will be an effect at the margin. And this effect at the margin is only understandable if you think in terms of a population with a curve of the preferences that are distributed between 0 and 1, for example, for a certain policy. Now, that I think is profoundly unintuitive. And it requires diagrams, it requires, curves, charts, and so on. It requires an appreciation of dynamic systems as opposed to just static descriptions. So because of that, it's extremely difficult to get out of this description of that is more intuitive and also morally charged of an employer and employee. They're facing each other. One works, the other one gives a salary, and that's it. So I think lots of evolutionary phenomena have this population dimension problem. I've very often told my students that, for example, we have a certain preference for, helping people within our group to helping people outside the group. We have an in-group bias, and that is easily explained in terms of our evolutionary past. And then people say, yes, but what about?
Yeah. So can I intervene there? I've documented this exact bias that you're speaking of. I call it the Katie Holmes, but bruh, Katie Holmes is taller than Tom Cruise, so Darwin is dead, right? So basically, right, any words that I say, men on average prefer to mate with nubile, fertile women. Somebody puts up their hand, but my Uncle Joe is dating an older woman, Linda. Oh, gee, Darwin is dead. Time to find a new job, right? Men are taller than women. But that's not true, Professor. My Aunt Gina is taller than my Uncle Bob. Again, Darwin is dead. So you're exactly right, because the reflex is to identify a singular, quote, violation at the individual level of a phenomenon that is only meant to be true at the population level. So you're exactly right. But that one, I typically see the general population or students committing. So in a sense, I'm a bit more charitable towards them because, it's their youthful indiscretion and stupidity. But what bugs me is as I said earlier, is the sophisticated academic who should be a professional thinker who keeps levying, but all you do is sit around smoking your pipe and coming up with just so stories. So.
Yes, no, I've noticed that the exception kind of idea is something that I think also used to be rife in anthropology when people would do cultural anthropology, and the holy grail of that research was to find that society where things are totally different, where
the Margaret Mead effect.
Right, exactly, where women are bossing around the men, where where warriors are despised and peaceful people are glorified, and so on, and sex roles are reversed. So we get this sort of idea that those exceptions are extraordinary to the extent that they exist, which in these cases is not the case. That these exceptions are profoundly meaningful because we think in terms of types and essences, like the employer, the lodger, and the landlord, and then, how they interact. Well, the Economics 101, maybe in the first lesson, tells you, no, it's the population of landlords and the population of renters. And in both cases, you get effects at the margin. I think that is very difficult. I think that also in the domain of biology is very difficult because biology is very essentialist. Our intuitive biology is very essentialistic. So we think of, the tiger as having this kind of essence, tigerhood, that makes it, pounce on prey. It's very difficult to think of biological species in terms that are not essentialistic. So I think, we have lots of those obstacles. But on the other hand, it seems to me that if you provide explanations that actually predict something new and explain something in a deeper way, it's not that difficult sometimes to convince people. I think that, Gad, you're like Don Quixote if you're trying to convince academics. It's like, it's like tilting at windmills. Once someone has, many years invested in something, you're not going to convince them that it's absurd.
I want to tell you a point at exactly what you just said. And this is a story that I've mentioned before, but it's worth repeating because it speaks exactly to your last point. Forgive me for interrupting you, where you said when they've been vested for many years. I gave 2 talks at the University of Michigan back when my first book was released. One was in the psychology department, one was in the business school. Exact same talk. Gave it in the psychology department, all went well. It was fantastic. Because there's a lot of people who were biological based and so on. Exact same talk in the business school. I couldn't get 2 words in. I was interrupted. I mean, tomatoes were being thrown at me, bombs, daggers. I was being lynched. Now, I did make an observation then, which perfectly corresponds to what you said. It turns out that the more junior the people were in the audience, the more they listened to what I was saying and said, this makes perfect sense. I mean, of course, you would use evolutionary theory to understand the consumer's mind. The more senior professors, the more horrifyingly hostile they were to me, precisely because of what you said, which is they've been vested in a paradigm which they believe, sometimes rightly so, sometimes wrongly so, that if biology boy comes on his horse and proves me wrong, then I'm dead, right? My life's... Now, in some cases, that is true, because if you believe that everything is a social construction, then yes, I am going to be... the Gad wrath is going to come down on you. But if you recognize that we could both coexist, you could work in proximate world, and I could hopefully offer some insights in the ultimate world, then the same phenomenon, conspicuous consumption, could be studied by you and me, and together we nail the phenomenon. So when I started explaining to them that what I'm stating doesn't necessarily negate your work, it hopefully only complements it and makes it better, then I felt that the hostility went a bit down. So you're exactly right that it's all about how much you've been vested in a paradigm.
Oh, yes. And I must say that each time I've heard discussions about ontology, people tend to think of culture in terms of nature and culture and nature and nurture and stuff. And I'm trying to teach students. I tell them on the first class that my aim is that once they've done my course, when they hear people talking about it's innate, so it can't be acquired, or it's acquired, they will laugh and say, I'm vastly superior to that. The problem is that it doesn't always work, because I've seen that some students 2 years later who tell me, it was great, your course, we learned that nothing is acquired. And oh my God, this is But anyway, the discussions about ontology are very often, I must say, discussions about I have a friend who in Paris who told me about all these discussions that people were saying, well, cognitive sciences are very bad, shouldn't be introduced in anthropology or sociology because there's the nature of the social, it's very different and stuff like that. And my friend was telling me the only appropriate explanation of these things is a crude pseudo-Marxist explanation. Whether people talk about ontology, they're talking about jobs, funds, credit, sort of grants and things like that. So when they say there's a role for the social above nature, what they mean is there should be grants for people like us too, as biological guys. Anyway, but that's that's anecdotal. But the interesting thing is that I think there are cognitive obstacles to understanding, for example, population dynamics. However, there are lots of cognitive obstacles to understanding calculus, and not to mention, imaginary numbers or quantum mechanics, and people manage that.
But they don't threaten your pet ideology, right?
Well, but that's yes. So what we have to do is, I think, bone up on the technical parts of evolutionary psychology, so that people, if they say, well, it's bad because it confirms our stereotypes about what men want and women want and blah blah blah, what we can say is that, well, but look at the actual sort of set of studies, the methodological care with which they're conducted, the hypothesis, the attention paid to null hypothesis, but also to alternative hypothesis, and so on and so forth. So I think after a while, this has an effect, but it has an effect again at the margin and only gradually. I would say your crusade against nonsense is a very courageous one.
Thank you.
It may succeed, although I'm pessimistic these days, but it may succeed because generations are renewed, and that's a far more important phenomenon than convincing people.
Right.
But yeah.
All right, let's get next to your religion stuff, especially your 2001 book. Before I cede the floor to you, let me sort of set up the background for those of you who are not familiar. So when you're typically discussing a cultural form from an evolutionary perspective, you could theorize one of several possible lines. You could say, well, this cultural form exists because it garners adaptive advantage by engaging in that form. So, for example, in the context of religion, David Sloan Wilson is someone who has argued for a adaptationist argument for religion using a group selectionist argument, meaning group A is more religious than group B. By being more religious, they're more communal, they're more cohesive, they're more likely to engage in reciprocal arrangements and so on. They will outsurvive group B. So that's an adaptationist argument. Then there is an opposing camp which says, well, no, sometimes these cultural forms, it is an evolutionary argument, but it's just a byproduct. It is piggybacking on computational systems that exist for different purposes. And so in this case, you are probably the person most famous and known for using that argument for why religion exists. So can you take it from there, given that I've set up the background?
Well, right. Okay, so this is very precisely where the disagreement lies, but also there's something else to that, which is that the more I've worked on these issues, the more I think that one of the sources of confusion is that we think that there is such a thing as religion, and that it's a very clearly sort of delineated sort of set of behaviors and thoughts and things like that. But that is largely a projection of a very special situation. Anthropology started when from Western societies that had religious institutions, organizations, churches, and so on. And it was largely an exercise in trying to find equivalents of our institutions in other places. So you would go to a certain tribe somewhere in Africa or Asia and say, what is their religion? And the thing is that this worked very well if you went to large-scale civilizations that had religious institutions. So you could go to India and find lots of Buddhism and Hinduism. You could find Islam, of course, and you could find something that didn't look too much like religion, but after all could be sort of, yanked into the religious category, and in China. But then when you go to small-scale societies, you find that if you ask people what their religion is, they have no idea what that could possibly be. But then they have all sorts of different things like cults to ancestors. They have various activities that we would call shamanism, sort of healing people or sort of remedying various problems by interacting with spirits and things of that kind. And the thing is that this is very, very different. It's so different that really the term religion, if it covers both, is extraordinarily misleading, because the people who do these things in small-scale societies do not have a doctrine. I did fieldwork in a place where people were talking about spirits and ancestors all the time, and if you ask them what they're like, where they come from, you get as many answers as you had interviewed people.
This is your work in Cameroon, right?
Yeah. And it's very general thing. There's no doctrine. There's no cosmology or interest in cosmology. So if you ask people why there's evil in the world, they will tell you that, well, it just is there, and that's it. And in practice, and what happens is that whatever we call religious activities are only pragmatic things. Like you need good crops, you need sick people to get better. So because of that, you perform these rituals. And when you're not doing that, you never think about these things anymore. It's not so. So this is so exotic that our concept of religion with faith, with voluntary adherence to certain, propositions and beliefs, is totally irrelevant. And I think that the small-scale stuff is absolutely crucial, because that's the conditions under which we evolved. We didn't evolve in large-scale societies with religious organizations. We evolved in places that maybe had shamanism, maybe had ancestor cult, maybe had things to do with dead people, and so on and so forth. But certainly not priests, and probably not doctrines, faith, and of course no literate doctrine or scriptures. So a great deal of, in my view, of this new idea that religion could be adaptive is based on projecting some features of modern religions onto this prehistoric or sort of ancestral environment, like saying that, for example, religion, commitment to a certain religion is a proof of commitment to a community, to a group. Well, that's not the case in small-scale societies. When you go consult a shaman, it's exactly like when you go consult a dentist. You're not thereby committing yourself to the community of people who go see dentists. You just want your tooth, fixed, and that's it. And the same goes for, so the same goes for shamanism and so on. Also, the social effects. So the idea of a direct adaptation is that there would be a pro-social motivation that comes from the fact that you think you're being watched by gods or spirits or things like that. The problem is, I think the evidence for that mechanism is very weak. And when it's there, it only comes from societies where you have religious organizations and a moralistic sort of God that's been inculcated into people's minds. So that's maybe true of people these days, but I'm not sure it's of evolutionary significance.